The air in Manhattan was thick with summer heat the day Ted Danson walked into that cramped casting office on West 44th Street. It was July 1975, and the young actor from Arizona had just signed his divorce papers that morning. His hand still trembled slightly as he held the sides for a soap opera audition, not from nerves about the role, but from the finality of what he'd just done. At 27 years old, Ted was starting over, and the city felt both impossibly large and suffocatingly small. The casting director, a woman named Margaret Chen, with sharp eyes and even sharper instincts, noticed something in Ted that day. It wasn't just his striking height or his unusual features. That angular face that could look both boyish and world-weary, depending on the light. It was something darker, something broken, that he was trying desperately to hide behind a practiced smile. "You're too tense," Margaret said, lowering her reading glasses. "Whatever happened to you this morning, leave it outside. Tom Conway doesn't carry that weight." Ted nodded, swallowed hard, and tried again. This time, something clicked. He got the part on Somerset, a daytime drama that would become his entry point into a world he both craved and feared. What nobody knew, what Ted himself barely understood at the time, was that his first marriage hadn't just ended. It had shattered something fundamental inside him, leaving behind questions about who he was and what he was capable of becoming in this brutal, glamorous industry. The Arizona Shadow. To understand Ted Danson in 1975, you had to understand where he came from. Flagstaff, Arizona wasn't just his hometown. It was the place that shaped his understanding of expectations and the weight of legacy. His father, Edward Bridge Danson, Jr., was the curator of the Museum of Northern Arizona, a man of considerable intellect and even greater reserve. The Danson name meant something in those academic circles, a lineage of scholars and thinkers. Ted grew up in the shadow of artifacts and ancient pottery, learning early that some things were meant to be preserved, protected, kept behind glass. But he also learned, through a curator named Bill Breed, that some things needed to be destroyed. At 12 years old, Ted participated in what Breed called billboarding, a guerrilla campaign against outdoor advertising signs that littered Arizona's pristine landscapes. Armed with axes and saws, young Ted and his friend Mark Guyad followed Breed into the desert night, destroying over 500 signs. It was illegal, dangerous, and absolutely thrilling. Every sign we took down, Ted would later recall in a moment of unguarded honesty, felt like we were saving something, but I think we were also destroying something in ourselves, some respect for rules, some understanding of boundaries. That confession happened in a dimly lit bar in Hell's Kitchen after Ted had finished a grueling 14-hour day on The Doctors. He was talking to a journalist named Claire Morrison, who was writing a piece about young actors in New York. Ted, slightly drunk on cheap whiskey, told her things he'd never said out loud. "My father never knew about the signs," Ted continued, his Arizona accent thickening with alcohol. "He was too busy preserving the past to notice I was trying to destroy the present. Maybe that's why I became an actor. I wanted to be anyone but the curator's son." The lucky break that wasn't luck in 1982 after years of struggling. Ted Danson auditioned for a new NBC sitcom called Cheers. The role was Sam Malone, a former baseball player turned bartender, a character that required charm, vulnerability, and the ability to make flawed masculinity somehow appealing. Ted was exhausted the day of the audition. Casey had been up all night with pain from her therapy, and Kate, now 3 years old, was going through a phase where she refused to sleep in her own bed. He'd gotten maybe 2 hours of sleep, and his audition was scheduled for 10 a.m. in a building that required him to take 2 buses because their car had broken down the week before, and they couldn't afford repairs. He almost didn't go, almost called to cancel. But Casey, propped up on pillows, still struggling with partial paralysis on her left side, looked at him with absolute certainty and said, "This is it. I can feel it. Go." Ted's audition was unremarkable by his own estimation. He read the sides, made the casting directors laugh in a couple of places, and left feeling like he'd done okay, but not great. What he didn't know was that the show's creators saw something in his exhaustion, a weariness that made Sam Malone feel real instead of like a television character. They called him back, then again, then offered him the role. The night Ted found out, he got cheers. He and Casey sat in their apartment holding hands, crying with relief and joy, and the bone-deep fatigue of people who'd survived something together. "We made it," Casey said. "You made it," Ted corrected. "This is all you." But even in that moment of triumph, there was a shadow neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Success was coming just as Casey was finally recovering enough to have her own career again. And Ted's new role would mean long hours, intense shooting schedules, and a level of fame that might change everything they'd built together. Epilogue: The Price of Dreams. The first season of Cheers finished last in the ratings. Critics loved it, but audiences hadn't found it yet. Ted spent those uncertain months wondering if he'd sacrificed so much for a show that would be canceled, leaving him back where he started, only older and more desperate. But the show survived. Ratings climbed. By 1983, Cheers was a hit, and Ted Danson was becoming a household name. What happened next? The affairs, the divorces, the scandals would become public record. But what remained private, what Ted kept locked away in the deepest part of himself, was the memory of those years in the 70s when he was nobody, when he was just a man from Arizona trying to save his marriage while his career slowly died, when he almost quit acting altogether to sell insurance because it would be more stable for his family. The 1970s made Ted Danson who he became, not the success of the 80s, not the fame or the awards or the recognition. It was those desperate, struggling years when every day was a choice between dreams and duty, ambition and love, the person he wanted to be and the person circumstances demanded. Years later, in 1995, after his second marriage to Casey had ended in one of Hollywood's costliest divorces, after his affair with Whoopi Goldberg had become tabloid fodder, after everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, Ted would sit in his therapist's office and say, "I think I've been running from 1979 my entire life, from that hospital room, from that moment when I realized that love sometimes means giving up everything you want. I got famous. I got successful. And then I spent decades proving I didn't deserve it by destroying every good thing I touched." The therapist simply nodded and said, "So when do you stop running?" Ted didn't have an answer that day. Maybe he still doesn't. But the 70s remained there. A decade of struggle and sacrifice and near misses. The foundation of everything that came after. The years when Ted Danson wasn't a star, wasn't famous, wasn't the man everyone thought they knew. He was just a man trying to survive, to love, to find some meaning in the chaos of pursuing an impossible dream, in an unforgiving city, and somehow, against all odds, he made it. But the cost, that's a story nobody really knows, not even Ted himself. Christmas Eve, 1979. The night. Everything changed. December 24th, 1979. Casey Coates went into labor with their first child, a daughter they'd already named Kate. Ted was filming a small role in a television movie, something forgettable that would air once and disappear. He'd told the director he might need to leave suddenly, kept his pager on him at all times. The call came at 3:47 p.m. Casey was at Mount Sinai Hospital. Labor was progressing normally. Ted rushed from the set, still wearing his costume, a police officer's uniform that he'd later burn because he couldn't stand the sight of it. He arrived at the hospital at 4:23 p.m. A nurse he'd never see again, a woman with kind eyes whose name tag read Patricia, stopped him in the hallway. "Mr. Danson, there's been a complication." Those 5 words, that's all it took to destroy the world Ted had been building. Casey had suffered a massive stroke during delivery. The baby was fine, perfect, healthy, crying with the fury of new life. But Casey was in critical condition, unconscious, fighting for survival in a way that made Ted's acting career feel obscenely trivial. He held Kate for the first time in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fear. She was so small, so impossibly fragile, with Casey's dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold questions she was too young to ask. Ted looked down at his daughter and made a promise that would alter the next decade of his life. "I will take care of both of you," he whispered, "no matter what it cost." He didn't know then how much it would cost, how many auditions he'd turned down, how many opportunities he'd watched slip away. Because he needed to be home, caring for Casey as she slowly, painfully learned to walk again, to speak again, to be herself again. The stroke had been severe. The doctors were honest about the prognosis. Casey might recover fully, or she might not. Time would tell. Patience was essential. Support was crucial. Ted became a full-time caregiver while trying to maintain some semblance of a career. He took every soap opera role he could get. The Doctors, guest spots on Laverne and Shirley. BJ and the Bear. Anything that paid and didn't require him to be away from Casey for too long. The hidden resentment. What nobody saw, what Ted never admitted even to himself during those years, was the quiet resentment that grew like a tumor in his chest. He loved Casey. He loved Kate. But some nights, after Casey had finally fallen asleep, following hours of physical therapy exercises, after Kate had been fed and changed and rocked, Ted would sit in their small living room and feel a rage so intense it scared him. He was 32 years old. His career was stagnating. Other actors from his Carnegie Mellon class were getting film roles, Broadway shows, opportunities that seemed to multiply, while his contracted. There was a commercial audition in 1980 for Aramis Cologne that he almost turned down because it meant being away for 3 days in Los Angeles. Casey, in a moment of clarity that cut through the fog of recovery, told him, "Go, I'll be fine. Michael can help." Ted went to Los Angeles. He got the Aramis commercial, becoming the Aramis Man, a role that would make him recognizable, but not quite famous. And in Los Angeles, staying in a cheap hotel in Burbank, he met a woman at the hotel bar whose name he would never remember. She was in her 30s, in town for a dental convention, a hygienist from Seattle, attractive in an uncomplicated way. They talked for an hour. She invited him to her room. Ted said yes, nothing happened. They kissed once, briefly, and Ted suddenly saw Casey's face, not as she was now, struggling and determined, but as she'd been that night in Soho, laughing at bad pickup lines. He left the woman's room, mumbling apologies, and spent the rest of the night walking the streets of Burbank, hating himself. Ted never told Casey about the almost affair, but the guilt followed him, coloring every interaction, every moment of caregiving, with the knowledge that he'd come so close to betraying the woman who needed him most. Claire never published that interview. 3 weeks later, she found out she was pregnant, not with Ted's child, but with her ex-boyfriend's, and she left journalism to move back to Ohio. The tape of their conversation sat in a box in her mother's attic for decades, a lost piece of history that captured a man at his most vulnerable. The first marriage. What really happened? Randy Gosh met Ted Danson at Carnegie Mellon University in 1969. She was everything he thought he wanted, talented, driven, from a respectable family in Philadelphia. They married quickly in 1970, riding the wave of young love and shared artistic ambition. But New York City had other plans for them. The acting world of the early 70s was brutal, especially for young couples trying to make it together. Every audition Ted got felt like a rejection for Randy. Every callback she received created tension neither of them knew how to process. They were competing for the same dream, and that dream was slowly poisoning them. There was also someone else, a presence in their marriage that nobody talked about, but everyone felt. Her name was Elena Vasquez, A casting assistant Ted met in 1973 during an audition for an off-Broadway production that never materialized. Elena was magnetic, dangerous, and completely unavailable. She was engaged to a successful television producer. Ted never touched Elena. He never even had a private conversation with her that lasted more than 5 minutes. But in his mind, in those lonely hours when Randy was at her waitressing job and he was alone in their tiny apartment, Elena represented everything exciting and forbidden about his new life in New York. Randy knew. Women always know. She found a napkin in Ted's jacket pocket from a cafe where Elena liked to have lunch. On it, Ted had written and crossed out multiple opening lines. I can't stop thinking about, would you ever consider, what if we... Nothing was written after those fragments. Nothing needed to be. The divorce in 1975 was quiet, civil, and absolutely devastating. Randy moved back to Philadelphia. Ted stayed in New York, got the role on Somerset, and tried to convince himself that he'd made the right choice. Elena Vasquez married her producer in the fall of 1975. Ted was not invited. He spent that evening in his apartment drinking alone, wondering if freedom was supposed to feel this much like failure. Casey Coates, the woman who saved him, Cassandra. Casey Coates entered Ted Danson's life like a force of nature in 1976. She was a producer, brilliant and uncompromising, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see through every performance, every mask. They met at a party in Soho, the kind of gathering where artists and wannabes mixed with people who actually had money and influence. Ted was there with a friend named Michael Brennan, a guy he'd met during his time on Somerset, who was convinced he was going to be the next Marlon Brando. Michael had a habit of introducing Ted to women by saying, "This is my friend Ted. He's going to be famous someday, so be nice to him now." Casey overheard this introduction and then laughed. "Is that your pickup line? Future fame?" Ted, embarrassed, tried to save face. "It's not my line. I'm just here for the free wine." "The wine is terrible," Casey said, "but the company might be worth staying for." They talked for 3 hours, not about acting or ambition or dreams of stardom, but about real things, books they'd read, places they wanted to travel, the difference between success and fulfillment. Casey had recently ended a long-term relationship with a man who'd wanted her to give up producing to support his career. She was done with men who needed women to be smaller. Ted fell in love that night, not with the idea of Casey, but with who he became when he talked to her. Smarter, funnier, more himself than he'd been in years. They married in 1977, and for a while it felt like Ted had finally found solid ground. Casey understood the industry. She didn't compete with him. She complimented him. She pushed him to take risks, to audition for roles that scared him, to stop playing it safe. But then 1979 arrived, and with it, a tragedy that would define them both.